I'm back. We return with Spoopyween Day 10. I am Shaggy Philaletea. Philaletea is a Greek word. It is a religious designation that means lover of truth. For those of you who are familiar with philosophia or philosophy, you will understand that what I am is a higher abstraction. I am what the original Christians called themselves. I am Shaggy in that I am both homeless and my hair and face are quickly going to become unkempt, but also I participate in the frankly dead storytelling tradition of the Shaggy dog. And so, what that means for you newcomers is that when I tell a story, I don't really have a beginning, middle, or end. I have lots of adjacent things that I want to talk about. And so I'm going to use the story as an opportunity to talk about other things. But today, we return to reading John Keel's The Mothman Prophecies, one of my very favorite books, maybe my actual very favorite book by my actual very favorite author. We return today with chapter 10, titled Purple Lights and April Foolishness. 1. My phones have gone crazy, Mary Hire noted. Even my unlisted numbers. Strangers call me at all hours of the day and night. Sometimes I get funny beeping sounds. Did you ever hear about anything like that? I had to admit I had. However, it had become my policy to say very little about these matters to anyone, even close friends. After Mary and I had concluded our interview with Charles Hearn and his wife in Ohio, Mr. Hearn had escorted us to the door and remarked, We've told you about everything we've seen, and you haven't told us a damn thing. I was so taciturn that the UFO buffs had surrounded me with an aura of mystery. They tend to surround everything with mystery. James Mosley, editor of Saucer News, now defunct, once told Gray Barker, he gives you the impression of not only knowing as much as we about flying saucers, but actually knowing a lot more, a lot that he's not telling. The truth was more mundane than mysterious. I was keeping many of my findings a secret to prevent pranksters from setting up hoaxes. Many of those findings are being revealed here for the first time. I maintained a low profile to curb rumors and prevent possible panic in the areas I was visiting. I avoided personal publicity, unlike most of the other self-styled UFO investigators who spent most of their time staging press conferences and building up scrapbooks. I'm going to lean in here to you. This is why, and sorry about the lighting. The lighting in here is weird today. It might just be that my phone camera got dirty. Forgive me. It might be. That may have made it worse. What I like about John Keel is exactly this. As an investigator, he was always low-key. He was never trying to get rich. He was never trying to be famous. He was never trying to hoax anything. He was never trying to get out in front of a flap. He was never trying to be a journalist, in other words, about any of this stuff. It was never about being first. For him, all of his books, it's just about being right. And that means that he's approaching this from a place of truth. And that's why, as Philaletea, I've chosen to introduce you to John Keel. Because whether you know it or not, if you sit and you listen to my videos, if you've listened to any 2 of my long-form videos, you are what is known in the mystical, magical, supernatural, spiritual, psychic realm as a seeker. Until you found what you're looking for, or at least found the X over which you need to dig, very much like the money pit up in Canada, Nova Scotia or wherever that is. It's in Newfoundland, right? Wherever that is, wherever the money pit, Oak Island is what that's called. Very much like Oak Island is this thing that we're doing now, if you've been here a few times. Seeking. And there are traps, and there are pitfalls, and there is an intelligence that was here first and doesn't want us to have the information and a functional enough brain, having done it, to communicate what we now know. And what I like about John Keel is John Keel didn't ruin his brain in the process. And you'll see that as we continue on. Even though he ran back into that factory, the TNT factory, in the last episode, I didn't want to... that one was going to be over an hour anyway. so I didn't go back over it. But even he says, and I don't need to explain this, that was insane. But his idea was to be a natural philosopher. This is a natural phenomenon, and I'm going to treat it as a natural phenomenon, which means that I'm in no real danger. Because he understands like I do, and like I tried to explain to the Astonishing Legends guys in a fit of empathy. It can't hurt you unless you believe it can hurt you. You gotta remember Japanese horror movie rules. I'm serious. The Japanese Shinto is much better about this stuff than we are, because Shinto was a liminal religion for longer, and it's existed doing what it does and collecting datum in its way, which is inadmissible in the West, but who gives a fuck what the West thinks? Finally, some of the things I was studying seemed so absurd on the surface, especially to the hardcore believers in extraterrestrial visitants, that revealing them would only produce more gossip, controversy, and nonsense. The idea isn't to get people talking about you. I want you talking about me, but what I don't want you doing is talking about me in association with particular phenomena. I want you talking about me as somebody who understands and wants to understand better and can help you understand better, help you develop the skill sets necessary to not rely on gossip, controversy, and nonsense to grow your brands. So help me grow my brand with truth and the opposites of gossip, controversy, and nonsense, and yours will grow as a result. The community of being in my comments, the community of being with me will help you, because I love selling other people's work. I would much rather sell my audience's work and their greatness than mine, because I have no personal greatness. I want no personal greatness. I live in a tent in the woods, and I'm happy with that. I do all of my recording in a public library, for which sometimes I have to wait an hour and a half before I can actually do my recording. And what I don't do is get all fucked up and upset about the missing time. Like, what I do is I just thank God for giving me an opportunity to do something else and usually presenting that other thing right in the moment. Today, for me, it was more work on Ezekiel and being able to explain to my audience in shorts what the wheel of the nonlinear dreamtime is and what it looks like, and how the rule of threes in magic works. And I think I introduced the rule of threes here with John Keel to this channel. So there's meta text happening. Dan Drazen and Dawn Australia expressed growing amazement and some fear as they traveled with me up and down the valley, listening to my strange questions and the even stranger answers we were getting from witnesses. A young woman in Point Pleasant was having telephone problems. Every night when she returned home from work at 5 o'clock, her phone would ring, and a man's voice would speak to her in a rapid-fire language she could not understand. "It sounds something like Spanish." "Yeah, I don't think it's Spanish," she complained. She protested to the phone company, but they insisted they could find nothing wrong with her line. We visited her home, and I examined her phone in a manner that had become routine for me. I took it apart. Drazen and Estrella watched me silently with a "he's really gone bananas" expression. What did telephones have to do with flying saucers? When you unscrew modern telephones, that is in the 1975, if you haven't ever seen a rotary phone or the old-timey handsets, this is going to be largely lost on you, but it's also visually it's going to be lost on you. But something I'm going to be teaching you as we move forward is to be less of a visual learner, to rely less on visuals, images, and icons, because they're a trap. I have to talk about it in another context, specifically about the thing, but I was listening to the Great Courses lecture about the neuroscience of learning, and he said a lot of things that were wrong and harmful in a boardroom-style elevator pitch of why you should care about Philosophy 101, and I object to his presentation, and I objected to many of the things he said. So what I need to do is I need to sit down with these books, and I need your permission, and I need your engagement to tell you when I'm just reading something for pleasure and I object to it, how can I get my objections into your ears in a way that you can then ask me questions so I can contextualize it without making a whole commentary like I'm doing with this, with John, with Ezekiel, with all of my other work, without making it this big ballooned out book of metatext, because he doesn't deserve it. That lecture was awful. It was awful for anyone who knows anything about anything. Now, if you're a dumbass and you've made it to adulthood and all you know is boardrooms, exactly the people that he was reaching to, if you're a tech bro or if you're a finance bro, all you know is nothing, and so you would be very surprised to learn the things that he knew, but he was teaching you. But anyway, when you unscrew modern telephone earpieces, you will often find a small piece of cotton, which serves as a cushion for the magnet and diaphragm. You shouldn't find anything else, but when I opened this woman's handset, I was startled to find a tiny sliver of wood. She said no one, not even the repairman, had ever opened up her phone before. The wooden object looked like a piece of a matchstick, sharpened at one end and lightly coated with a substance that looked like graphite. Later, I showed it to telephone engineers, and they said they'd never seen anything like it before. I put it in a plastic box and stored it away. Years later, while visiting a magic store in New York, sleight of hand is one of my hobbies, I glanced at a display of practical jokes and discovered a cellophane package filled with similar sticks. Cigarette loads. Somehow, an explosive cigarette load had gotten into that Point Pleasant telephone. Who put it there, when, how, and why must remain mysteries. So I got back to my tent 2 or 3 days ago. This is a relevant story. I got back to my tent 2 or 3 days ago, and I had bought this little battery-operated lamp. Looks like a Coleman lamp, and it wasn't working. It wouldn't turn on. And so I opened it up, and the batteries, all 3 of the batteries in it, had been turned around the other way. It had been closed properly, and when I flipped them back, it still didn't work. So it just didn't work. But the batteries had all been turned around. So either someone found my tent and fucked with my lamp, a strange thing to do, or some kind of psychic phenomenon, some sort of ultra or paranormal phenomenon, fucked with my lamp, turned my batteries around, and in so doing, made enough of an electromagnetic, energetic connection that it fucked up the actual electronics of that machine. Which is possible. That's all of what I'm saying is possible. All you have to do is decide for yourself to believe that this datum about supernatural intelligences and electromagnetic interference that they are capable of, maybe that they are. All you have to do is believe that's possible, and then everything else that comes with it is possible. You make electromagnetic waves. You make several different varieties of electromagnetic waves in your brain. So why can't they? And why can't they just be amplified or at some magnitude or power or presence that fucks up electronics? Because electronics get fucked up around them. And anyway, tricksters, one of the things that tricksters are able to do is manifest things in places they're not supposed to. So that exploding cigarette load, it's just a little to seem like your cigarette. You hand somebody an exploded cigarette. Like if you're familiar with old cartoons, it was a gag in cigars. You hand somebody an exploding cigar and then they've got smoke and shit all over their face. But that's really dangerous. A magician wouldn't actually do that. He'd just hand you one that goes and makes a big. I actually don't know what it looks like, but it wouldn't hurt you. It would just be maybe like one of those poppers that you throw on the ground and they make the big loud noise. Anyway, if the entity knew, because these entities are outside time, so if it knows in the future that John Keel's going to be there and what it wants to do, and what it does want to do is keep you interested. One of the surest fire ways, if you have an entity that is bothering you, to make it stop is to ignore it. One of the surest fire ways to make it do insane things to bother you is to deny it. But if you accept that it's there and you acknowledge it, but you don't interact with it, it'll eventually get tired and go find someone who will. But if you give it all these denials and you're not spiritually prepared, you're not in a manner of speaking, wearing the armor and decked in the well, if you don't have the arms, that is the weapons, and you're not decked in the armor of the Lord, so to speak, if you don't have good protective magic from a very strong, a very powerful, and a very reliable extra human source, you're just fucked. That's where poltergeist and demon activity come from, are trying to deny the thing. That's when it gets ugly, is when you want to try to take from it what it wants, because they aren't like us. They don't have brains. They don't grow up. They're very much pedantic children. Very much. Soon after my investigation, anyway, it would have done that to keep him interested, because his interest, as he's saying, his interest waxes and wanes. And they would also, you don't believe this, you don't know this because you haven't read enough of these paranormal stories, but they want particular authors publishing. Authors like writers, people who end up writing, like, I think his name is Sanderson, was one of the first, and in this book, the example is Woody Derenberger. These people who write, they don't, the UFO, the contactee, or I'm sorry, the thing contacting you doesn't want you writing, because this is all connected to the prophetic tradition that's captured in the biblical tradition. And all of this data that's going to, quote, ordinary people, is meant to be going to the world leaders. It's meant to be going to mayors and governors, police chiefs, presidents, senators, these things. And so the phenomenon showing up, and it's very unlikely that it would show up and bother somebody who's illiterate or not particularly literate. So Woody Derenberger, he may have had something happen that one time, but everything else is unlikely to have happened. You understand? If it did happen, it means that he's withholding elements of his character. He's withholding elements of his free time and his leisure time, what he reads, what he watches, what he thinks about, what he ponders, how he actually spent his time was being withheld from the audience, and that's why he didn't blow up. Not just because he was being opaque, but because this phenomenon doesn't like liars and it doesn't like self-aggrandizers. That's why his daughter died before she was able to publish her book, that she was trying to self-aggrandize and make money off this phenomenon. The phenomenon chose to murder her instead. It chose to let her die. That's how it works. That's how it works in fact. It's all over the scripture. You can read the Bible and it tells you explicitly how this stuff works. And so we are reading the Bible together. And I'm showing you where it's telling you this stuff. Soon after my investigation, the woman's phone call ceased. Yeah, I'd only wanted to get him there. Maybe I exorcised the phone by removing the stick. No, the phone was only haunted. It was only bothering her to get you there, John. Another family was having telephone problems and many other troubles besides on the Camp Conley Road on the southern edge of the TNT area in Point Pleasant. The woman in Point Pleasant who suffered the calls from a bizarre, metallic voice speaking in an incomprehensible language was their daughter-in-law. And this incomprehensible language thing, the ancient alien guys always want to make a claim that it's a Semitic language or Sumerian. Always they make that claim. But why Hebrew would be so important to these entities that are technically older than human beings is not clear to me, because Hebrew, like Greek, like Latin, like the northern Egyptian languages, they're bullshit languages. They're not good for describing this stuff. The Ionic Greek specialized in it, and then Attic Greek copied and claimed for itself that specialization. But the words required double and triple and quadruple meanings. Even today, English is better because it has a huge vernacular. We have a huge vocabulary. But because the vocabulary is so good, the common person has access to something insane, like only a tenth of the words, which means that you don't even have 1% of the necessary understanding just in the words that you can use knowingly. You lack like 1% of the necessary understanding to reach enlightenment through language, through images, is what I'm telling you. You lack the information. You lack the necessary data. It didn't take us long to learn that when our TV started acting up, it was a sure sign that one of those lights was passing over. James Lilly, a no-nonsense riverboat captain, told us. I didn't think much of all the flying saucer talk until I started seeing them myself. You've got to believe your own eyes. At first, the Lillys kept their sightings to themselves. But gradually, rumors began to circulate and carloads of people gathered on Camp Conley Road every night to watch the space people fly by. We've seen all kinds of things, Mrs. Lilly said. Blue lights, green ones, red ones, things that change color. Some of them have been so low that we thought we could see diamond-shaped windows in them, and none of them makes any noise at all. Automobiles near the Lilly home began to stall inexplicably. This is another thing. It's strange that the paranormal or ultranormal can affect analog machinery like gears and internal combustion engines. And the Lilly's little ranch house became haunted soon after the lights started their nightly flyovers. Kitchen cabinet doors slammed in the middle of the night. Once their living room door, which they locked with both a chain and snap lock at night, was standing ajar when they got up in the morning. They heard loud metallic sounds, like a falling pan. Then Mrs. Lilly heard a baby crying. It sounded so plain, she said, that I looked around the house even though I knew there was no baby here. It seemed to come from the living room, only a few feet away from me. One of my sillier sounding questions is, did you ever dream there was a stranger in the house in the middle of the night? When I directed the question at the Lillys, Jackie Lilly urged her quiet 16-year-old daughter, Linda, to tell about the nightmare she had had that March. She was reluctant to discuss it, but with a little coaching from the sideline, she explained how she woke up one night and saw a large figure towering over her bed. It was a man, she said, a big man, very broad. I couldn't see his face for a while, but I could see that he was grinning at me. Jim was working on the river that night, Mrs. Lilly added, and Linda woke me up with a terrible scream. She cried out there was a man in her room. I told her she was dreaming, but she screamed again. He walked around the bed and stood right over me, Linda declared. I screamed again and hid under the covers. When I looked up again, he was gone. She came running into my room, Mrs. Lilly said. She cried, there's a man in my room. There is. She refused to sleep alone ever since. When I asked for a description of the stranger, Linda said she thought he was wearing a checkered shirt. Bedroom phantoms and checkered shirts are old hat to investigators of psychic phenomenon. That's strange to me. That's strange to me. Why checkered? I've come upon this again and again, so often that I've written long articles about it. In some cases, these ghosts in plaid are accompanied by the odor of hydrogen sulfide and sudden chills of sudden blasts of heat, while other episodes are probably purely hypnopompic. That is, they are the residue of dreams which overlap briefly into the waking state, a phenomenon well known in psychiatry and parapsychology, also known as the sleep paralysis. I once enjoyed a hypnopompic experience myself. In the winter of 1960-61, I contracted walking pneumonia, and I walked with it until I dropped. Early one morning, while I was still quite sick and my system was laden with antibiotics and drugs, I woke up and saw a large black form hovering at the foot of my bed. It wasn't a man in a checkered shirt, but was roughly the shape of a Coca-Cola bottle. What do you know? I'm having a hallucination, I told myself as I lifted my head and studied the apparition. The blob slowly receded, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared. The experience never repeated. 2. Drazen and Estrella returned to New York City in late March, while I decided to remain on in Point Pleasant. Dan was convinced that something exceptional was happening in the Ohio Valley, and he planned to collect a camera crew and return. We had seen a number of odd aerial lights, but the oddest of all was so bewildering I didn't even bother to take notes. We were standing on a hilltop outside of Point Pleasant one night when Mrs. Heyer called our attention to a bright red light, slowly moving toward us. It had the shimmering, prismatic appearance of a classic UFO light, and Dan, who was a student pilot, agreed it wasn't a plane. No more wing lights or tail lights. No normal wing lights or tail lights were visible. The sky was crystal clear, and there was only one small cloud overhead. The light moved very slowly and appeared to be at a low altitude. There was no sound whatsoever. We watched as the light slowly approached the little cloud and disappeared into it, or over it. Then we waited for it to reappear. Seconds ticked into minutes. The light did not come out from behind the cloud. Maybe it went straight up, Mary suggested. Suddenly, there was a distinctive drone of an airplane engine, and the obvious silhouette of a small plane emerged from the cloud, wings and taillights flashing. It buzzed off at an altitude of 3,000 or 4,000 feet, and we laughed at ourselves, momentarily convinced that our UFO had just been an airplane. However, the more I thought about the incident, the more incredible it seemed. Well, that's very similar to what I experienced. However, the more I thought about the incident, the more incredible it seemed. We should have been able to see the plane's silhouette clearly before it entered the cloud, and it should not have taken so long to pass through such a small cloud. Something was definitely out of kilter. Later, I began to study the mystery planes and phantom helicopters that have appeared all over the world, and several reports of UFOs that seemingly turned into conventional airplane configurations surfaced. One of the most recent comes from Canada, where a group of outdoorsmen in Cowichan River and British Columbia watched a low-flying object in October 1973. It didn't make a sound, and it was something we had never seen before, one of the witnesses reported. There were 3 red lights rotating around the top part, and there were blinking red lights going in the opposite direction around the middle part, don't you know? There was another light at the very top, a red flashing one. Then, from the bottom, a white light shone out like a spotlight. It moved its beam up the river as if it were looking for something. By this time, we were all pretty scared. We thought sure the others at the camp must have seen it too, but afterward they said they hadn't seen a thing. There was a bend in the river between us, so I couldn't say for sure whether they did or not. The witnesses claimed they got a good look at the thing, that it was circular, about 80 feet in diameter, hovering about 200 feet in the air, and had been in view for a full 15 minutes. How did it depart? Well, if we told people about this, they'd think we were crazy, the witness said. But all of a sudden it looked as if it had turned into an airplane. It made a noise like a plane, and it looked like a plane, only all the lights went out except for a little red one. It went right past us and disappeared over the trees. As I'm sitting here reading this, I can remember the green wing lights. And I want to say I remember thinking it was weird, that the lights were weird. It gets you. I was just telling you the other day, whether it was yesterday's John Keel or in another, that man, the paranormal, there's always a detail that's just slightly wrong, and man, I want to say I remember those wing lights not blinking and thinking, they're supposed to blink and they're supposed to be red. But who remembers? Maybe they were red and I was thinking they needed to be green. No one else saw it, and man, I was so shook I didn't take video of the plane. The witnesses claimed they got a good look at the thing, that it was circular, about 80 feet in diameter, hovering about 200 feet in the air. And had been in view for a full 15 minutes. How did it depart? Well, if we told people about this, they'd think we were crazy, the witness said. But all of a sudden, it looked as if it had turned into an airplane. Yeah, right. It made a noise like a plane, and it looked like a plane, only all the lights went out except for a little red one. It went right past us and disappeared over the trees. Disappeared over the trees, man, right behind a tree. Maybe I hallucinated this. The thing is, I don't remember this story. I've read this book so many times, and I don't remember this. Had read it so many times before that. I read it 3 or 4 times before I had that experience. Throughout West Virginia, I had heard stories of large, gray, unmarked airplanes hedge-hopping the treacherous hills. I knew the Air National Guard kept some cargo planes at the Charleston airport and that some training flights involved hedge-hopping to keep below radar beams. But none of the flights reported to me proved to be the work of the National Guard. Drazen and Australia had hardly started out for New York when all hell began to break loose. Late on the afternoon of March 31st, a workman in the Point Pleasant lumber yard saw a glowing object hovering over the home of Mrs. Doris Deweese. Shortly afterward, Mrs. Deweese watched a luminous object zip across the sky and crash into a small shack on a neighboring hillside. The shack housed the transmitter for Sheriff Johnson's police radio. It started to burn. What followed was straight out of the Keystone Cops. The police and fire department rushed to the snow-covered hill and bogged down on the mushy dirt road. There was much frantic scurrying and cursing as the men battled the blaze. Part of the hillside was badly scorched. The transmitter inside the shack was not affected by the fire, but it was burned out, as if it had been struck by lightning. So in the critical days that followed, the sheriff's department was without its main transmitter. I was disenchanted with the TNT area because of the crowds that were now streaming back there nightly to watch for the newest sensation, flying saucers. I started searching for a private place where I could carry out my observations quietly. Dawn, Dan, Mary, and myself had interviewed a number of people in the little community of Gallipolis Ferry, a couple of miles south of Point Pleasant on Route 2, and I had been impressed by their testimony. House lights frequently dimmed there, and television sets often acted up late at night. Great blobs of light had been seen on top of the wooded hills in the sparsely settled animal preserve called the Chief Cornstalk Hunting Grounds, just south of the village. One resident was having trouble with poltergeist phenomenon, lights moving through his house, rapping on the doors and windows, the sounds of babies crying, and women screaming, telephones malfunctioning, the works. Rolf Lee, a farmer with a big spread in the area, confessed that he had seen so many UFOs over his land that he didn't pay attention to them anymore. Officer Harold Harmon and I slipped away to Gallipolis Ferry on the night of March 31st while nearly everyone was headed for the TNT area. We soon saw a number of bright star-like objects which flitted about the sky with rapid zigzag movements. 2 local teenagers were sitting on a nearby hilltop next to a roaring bonfire, hoping to lure the UFOs down. I called up to him and asked them to put the fire out, knowing that bright lights tended to repel rather than attract the objects. Harmon fiddled vainly with his police radio. He could get nothing but static. Later, I learned that all the police forces for miles in both directions had constant trouble with their radios that week. Heavy magnetic interference totally disrupted communications among law authorities while the UFOs carried out their mysterious missions. The destruction of Sheriff Johnson's transmitter was just one small part of the scenario. Telephones, too, went bonkers that week. It seemed as if half the phones in the valley were either out of order altogether or were clogged with crazy beeps and buzzes. Accompanied by the 2 teenagers, I left Harmon and hiked into the nearby hills in the total blackness. As my eyes became acclimated to the night, I began to distinguish a number of vague purple shapes hovering over a woods on Rolf Lee's property. At first, I thought they might be stars low in the sky gleaming through the natural haze. But when I flashed my 6-celled light at one of these purple blobs, it suddenly and jerkily moved to one side, as if it were jumping out of my light beam. Fascinated, I repeated the experiment several times. Then I tried flashing the light at obvious stars to see if this wasn't just some trick of my eyesight. The stars didn't move. Naturally. We sat on the hilltop studying the purple blobs for several minutes when suddenly the whole forest in the valley below lit up and glowed with a bright, eerie purple light. There were no houses or roads down there. It would have been a long hike in the dark, and the boys were reluctant to join me, so we just sat and stared at the glowing forest until the light faded. 3. The next night, Saturday, April 1st, Mary Heyer and I drove up 5 Mile Creek Road down Gallipolis Ferry until we reached a hilltop which commanded a view of the hills and valleys I had visited the night before. There was a single farmhouse on the hill, and the people who lived there went to bed at 9:30 each night, being early risers. so the whole area was silent, deserted, and without lights throughout the night. A few minutes after we arrived, Mary pointed out a small reddish light low on a steep wooded hill south of our position. It appeared to be blinking on and off and bobbing up and down in a manner quite different from any of the stars on the horizon. While we watched breathlessly, barely speaking, it slowly circled the distant fields and woods and crossed in front of us, edging closer and closer. The farmhouse was about 75 feet in front of us. The object now appeared to be square or rectangular. It could not be mistaken for a star. It vanished momentarily behind some trees north of the farmhouse, and when it reappeared, it was much closer. Now we could make out a dark form. The red glow seemed to be a window. It hovered about 50 feet off the ground. I thought I could see a shadowy human figure in the window, but Mary thought it was some kind of partition. This was the only point on which we disagreed. We sat transfixed for several minutes, fully expecting the object to land directly in front of us and ask to be taken to our leader. I finally got out of the car and flashed my powerful beam directly at the object. It responded instantly, quickly shooting straight up into the sky, the red light going out completely. I guess I blew it, I groaned. But there would be other nights and more funny lights. The following night, we returned to the same hilltop. The brilliant night sky was filled with stars, and things not on my star map. We could easily recognize the UFOs because they were brighter and more brilliantly colored than normal stars. Some were red flashers, some were cold purple blobs, and some were multicolored. Mrs. Heyer confirmed that they jumped out of the way of my flashlight. I picked out an especially large object and flashed dot dot dash dot dash dot 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 dash dot dash dot dot dash dot dash dot dot, which spells descend. Mary gasped as it began to lose altitude. It looks like it's going down a flight of stairs, she noted. We were watching the famous falling leaf motion, which has been described by many UFO witnesses. About 12:30 a.m., Mrs. Heyer decided to call it a night. She drove off, leaving me alone in my car, sitting, like an idiot, waiting for something to happen. And it did. 1 hour later, at 1:35 a.m. on April 3rd, 1967, I had my best sighting. A clearly defined circular object suddenly zipped down from the sky and passed parallel to my car. It was so colorful that it's burned into my memory. The greenish upper surface was topped by a bright red light. There were reddish portholes or circular lights around the rim. The colors were so brilliant they were almost unearthly. It disappeared behind some trees to my left. I felt it was very close, perhaps only a few hundred feet from my car. Although it had been in full view for several seconds, I never even thought of picking up the movie camera on the seat beside me. Yeah, never even considered it. After I took those pictures and knew that it knew where I was, didn't even consider trying to take a picture of the plane. I'm disappointed in myself for that. I was so proud. Oh, here we go. Utter bewilderment. I had 3 interesting physical reactions to the sighting. First of all, although I am used to prowling graveyards and TNT areas alone at night, I was scared to death. My first thought was to start the car and get the hell out of there. But I managed to brace myself. I did lock the car doors. Second, while I was watching the object, I thought I heard a sizzling or hissing sound. Later, I realized I couldn't be sure if the sound had been real. Third, the next morning, my eyes were sore and reddened. They felt like they were full of sand. I had a mild case of conjunctivitis, and it persisted for several days. In my notebook, I scribbled 2 a.m., drove to turnaround point, a driveway by a barn down the road, turned and returned to original parking position, unable to see anything in ravine, no lights or signs of activity, still scared, not anxious to get out of my car. Another note reads, no sign of moon, which was supposed to rise at 1:59 a.m. This referred to something that had happened the night before. After the object with the reddish window had disappeared, Mary and I sat in the darkness for a long time when suddenly a great glowing object appeared behind some trees on a distant hill. It was red and large, and we both thought we could see a human figure moving about on the hill. We really thought something had landed there. After a few minutes, the object slowly rose upward, and to our mutual embarrassment, we saw that it was the moon. I had never seen a moonrise exactly like that one, so I decided to deliberately watch the moon the following evening. I checked the papers for the time the moon was supposed to come up, but it never did. That night, as I say, was cloudless and star-filled, but the moon never appeared. I stayed in the area until 3:30 a.m., and the moon was still conspicuously absent when I left. Now, you can never believe anyone's claims about the moon, but we want to believe that John Keel experienced what he experienced. The night after the moon appeared, right on schedule. Sheriff Johnson, Deputy Halstead, Mary Heyer, and I went back to 5 Mile Creek Road the next afternoon to look for my saucer. Now, if he had corroborating evidence, like he could get a quote here from Mary or the sheriff or any of these other people saying, yep, we were on that hill with you. Yes, you could see the moon the night before. No, you could not see it that night. Yes, you could see it the third night. If he had even that. But that's why weird shit, unexplainable shit like that, that's anxiety. It happens when you're alone. Because it doesn't want everyone to tell. That's what you don't understand. It's about you. It's about reaching out and getting you. What Ezekiel has taught me, what Jonah, what Job, what reading all these ancient prophets and the very ancient books of the Bible has taught me is that the God of the cosmos, he really wants a relationship with you individually and really does not give a fuck about kings and presidents. It's the other thing that tries to get kings and presidents' attention. You will be brought before the highest people in the world if God wants you doing that. There's no way that you won't be. And so the way he won't contact you to do that is as an ET, as an alien, as a UFO. He wouldn't do that. It wouldn't make sense for him to do that. Now, you might mistake what you've seen as that because sometimes he only shows us to us and what we can understand. And so you might be simple or foolish enough to visualize and interpret what you've seen as extraterrestrial, but it's more likely theoi and not dei, or it's most likely a theon, right? Rather than the God of the universe. So I've gone and forgot where I was. I'm sorry. Deputy Halstead carried a Geiger counter. As Johnson followed my car up the hill, he was startled when his car radio suddenly sprang to life, emitting police calls from an adjoining county. The amazing thing was his radio was turned off at the time. It had to be turned on with a key, and the key was not even in the lock. We searched for scorch marks, broken tree limbs, radioactivity, anything that could have provided evidence of my sighting. But as Halstead and I clambered around the ravine, I was chagrined to find that my estimates must have been way off. The object must have been further away from me than I thought, and therefore it had to be bigger than I thought. I estimated it was only 15 or 20 feet in diameter. In my favor was the fact that there were widespread UFO sightings in the nights of April 2nd to 3rd. South of Charleston, West Virginia, a large group of people, including several state police officers, watched a formation of 15 lights maneuver over a forest and descend. Every night I went to the hill at 5 Mile Creek Road, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by a few others. And every night I saw a variety of strange aerial objects. Only 2 airplanes passed over on a regular schedule, one at 11 p.m. and another at 2 a.m. Each night from 3 to 8, unidentified stars appeared. They were always in the same position at the beginning of each evening, and a casual observer would automatically conclude that they really were just stars. However, on overcast nights, these unidentifieds would be the only stars in the sky, meaning they were below the clouds. While the rest of the night sky slowly rotated, these phony stars would remain in their fixed positions. Makes you think of Ezekiel's word for heaven as false waters. These phony stars would remain in their fixed positions, sometimes for hours, before they would begin to move. Then they would travel in any direction, up, down, clockwise, etc. That's how Ezekiel describes his vision, as doing all of that, and being red, bright and red. They had a number of curious traits, also having the effect of a rainbow. They had a number of curious traits. When a plane would fly over, they would suddenly dim or go out altogether. As soon as the plane was gone, they would flare up again. It was always impossible to judge their size, altitude, or distance. Sometimes I thought they were relatively close, only to find they were actually miles away, traversing the river. Boatmen on the river were obviously watching them also. Occasionally, a searchlight from a riverboat would suddenly shoot into the sky, aim straight at an object I was watching, and the object would skitter out of the way. I doubted that these funny lights were spaceships from Andromeda, and I made a strenuous effort to find rational explanations. Dr. Donald Menzel, a Harvard astronomer, advocates an air inversion theory contending that these lights are ordinary lights reflecting off layers of warm or cold air and producing a mirage effect. This theory wasn't workable on 5 Mile Creek Road simply because there weren't enough light sources. A large radio antenna some miles down the river did produce some interesting effects. When there was a haze, the flashing red lights on the antenna were an eerie sight from my hill and never failed to excite first-time visitors to my lookout post. 3 or 4 days after my monumental UFO sighting, I was sitting in Mary's office when she became very thoughtful. "You know, there's something I've been meaning to tell you," she began hesitantly. "I don't know why, but it always seems to slip my mind. That night that I left you early, the night you saw that colored disc. When I got to Route 2 and started for Point Pleasant, I saw a big globe of light right on the river. I couldn't figure out what it was, but I didn't stop. The funny thing is, I forgot it completely. I didn't remember it until a day or so afterward, then I forgot again. I can't understand it. I've always had a very good memory." Lacunal amnesia, loss of the memory of specific incidents or moments in time, is a common part of the phenomenon. In December 1967, Faye Carpenter, Connie's mother, had a more baffling attack of amnesia. The night that Jack Brown visited Connie, Chapter 2, Mrs. Carpenter had opened the door for him. He was in shirt sleeves, no jacket or coat, although it was extremely cold. She was not going to let him in, but she did, and she had absolutely no memory of his visit afterward, even though she had been present when he talked with Connie, Keith, and Larry. That's the Black-Eyed Kids do that same thing, man. The Black-Eyed Kids. That story spooks me all the way out. Those stories. In the days following Mr. Brown's visit, a poltergeist settled in the Carpenter household. Securely fastened, pictures fell off the walls. Small objects disappeared from shelves and reappeared in unlikely places. The manifestations lasted about 2 weeks. 4. During her news-gathering rounds, Mary Heyer was approached by a professional woman in Gallipolis, Ohio, the town directly across the river from Gallipolis Ferry, West Virginia. She said she heard I was in the area and she wanted to talk to me. My motel, the Blue Fountain, was on the outskirts of Gallipolis, so I arranged a meeting with the family. She held a very responsible job and insisted on anonymity, as so many witnesses do, so I will call her Mrs. Bryant. We met in a private office in a major company in Gallipolis. Mrs. Bryant was a reserved, well-spoken, middle-aged woman who looked slightly fatigued from overwork. She was very secretive and suspicious at first, but after I showed her my parcel of credentials, she relaxed somewhat. It was obvious she had been through a great deal, and she was concerned I would not believe her. She had gone to the local authorities, she said, and they had laughed at her. I assured her that I wouldn't laugh, that I was accustomed to hearing incredible stories from credible people. "Last November, I think it was the 2nd or 3rd, she began, I was out behind this building getting ready to go home. It was 7 or 8 o'clock. Suddenly, there was a little flash, like a camera flash gun going off, directly above me. And then I saw a thing. Some kind of flying machine. I couldn't move. I guess I was frozen with fright. This thing landed right there in the parking lot, not 20 feet away from me. It was like a big cylinder. Anyway, it didn't make the slightest bit of noise. It just drifted down and stopped. Like I say, I couldn't move. I guess I started praying. Then 2 men came out of it and they walked over to me." She studied me anxiously, as if expecting me to laugh. "What did they look like?" I asked. "They were just normal-sized, normal-looking men, but their skins were a funny color. Dark, like maybe they were heavily tanned. The light was pretty bad there, so I couldn't see them all that well." "Were they Negroes?" No, they didn't have Negroid features. Their faces seemed kind of pointed. You know, pointed nose, pointed chins, high cheekbones. There was a kind of evil look about them. I was afraid I was going to get robbed or attacked. You know, other authors. I don't know if John Keel's the one who suggested it first, but I know that other guy. There's another guy that I don't like as much. Nick Redfern. I don't like Nick Redfern as much. I may not like Nick Redfern at all. He might be a hoaxer who's star fucking, doing his best to chase the cash. It's either Nick Redfern or John Keel, and it might be Nick Redfern says it because John Keel got away with saying it in the 80s or the 90s, but there's a suggestion that the Jewish or broadly Middle Eastern characteristics being demonized in the Middle Ages by Christians, there's a non-zero chance that that happened because of these kind of entities that look like them. And so that sounds racist. But if we take the head binding thing and we just think about humans, there's a non-zero chance that our gods didn't look like us until our eugenics cults genetically modified us through selective breeding to look like our gods. And so what that means is that entities like this are theoi is the plural, not deity. Which means that the broadly Oriental look of the Middle East was an adaptive trait. And that the reason it shows up as the bad guys in the Middle East isn't because they were demonizing a real people with whom they had real access, to whom they had real access, with whom they had real conflict, but people that they tried to be kind to and include in their culture who turned out to be actual demons. How were they dressed? I leaned back and lit my pipe. As near as I could tell, they were wearing some kind of coveralls, something like a uniform. Then they started talking to me. She kept watching me, reluctant to continue. What did they have to say? I prompted, trying to avoid leading questions. Well, it was all pretty silly. They just wanted to know my name, where I was from, what I did for a living, things like that. Sometimes it was hard to understand them. Their voices were sort of sing-songy and high-pitched. That's very interesting because one of the things that sticks out in my mind just about my prophetic, you might even call it, my prophetic literary work, which is a story, which you could call fictional, and I'd be fine with that. My shapeshifters sing instead of talking. And I didn't pick that up from this. I picked that up before I started studying the paranormal at all. I wrote that book before I started studying the paranormal. And then I was like, you're writing a book about the paranormal and paranormal phenomena. You should maybe not intuit every detail of your book. But it turns out my intuition, every intuition that I had with that first book, if I had just sent it out for publication, I'd be a billionaire right now. She kept watching me. What do they have to say? Well, it was pretty silly. They had their voices were sort of sing-songy and high-pitched. It was like listening to a phonograph record played at the wrong speed. And they kept asking me for the time. They asked, "What's your time?" 2 or 3 times. Finally, they just walked back to the thing and it took off. Then I could move again. I was scared out of my wits, but I decided not to tell anyone. Then, a couple of days later, I heard about a man up near Parkersburg who had the same thing happen to him. I'm going to be honest with you, I very rarely ask people what time it is, because that's a supernatural thing. Asking people, what time is it? What year is this? What day is it? I very infrequently do that, because 2 things. It suggests that you don't have enough money and enough status to have a phone and internet access or a watch. 3 things. The second thing is that it suggests that you're a disorganized person and unreliable. And so just don't ask girls that, especially pretty girls that you want to talk to, because they're going to think you're just scatterbrained and unreliable because of the first thing. But these 2 things pair together. And then the third thing is that you're a shapeshifter. that you're not from here. If you don't know what the standard things that every single person should know, it used to indicate you're not from here. And that can mean not from this planet, not from this time, not from this reality. And that it used to be a big deal. It used to be a big deal to be from here. People don't ask it so much anymore, but an old man asked me today, he goes, "You're not from here, are you?" No, I'm obviously not from here. I don't even talk like I'm from here. And that, we're going to have to talk about that later. Keep that in your head. The way you talk says a lot about where you're from, how you spend your time, and what quality person you are. I was scared out of my wits, but decided not to tell anyone. Then a couple of days later, I heard about a man up near Parkersburg who had the same thing happen to him. "His name is Woodrow Derenberger," I volunteered. "Have you met him?" "No, I just heard something about him on the radio." She paused and moistened her thin lips. "I wonder, did he ever see those men again?" "He says he did." She looks relieved. "Well, I saw them again. I saw them in broad daylight, walking right down the main street in Gallipolis. This time they were dressed in normal clothes. They looked like anybody. They sort of nodded to me when they passed me. I got scared all over again, real scared. That's when I went to the police and told them what I saw. They laughed at me and said I was probably just imagining things." She paused again and shook her head sadly. "You see, I've been to the police before, about my cattle rustlers. I think they think I'm some kind of a nut. I went to the FBI, too. They came out to my place but said they couldn't find anything. After that, somebody tapped my telephone. Maybe it was the FBI. I was scribbling in my pocket notebook. A year or two earlier, I would have classified Mrs. Bryant as a paranoid schizophrenic, but she didn't seem like a common, run-of-the-mill nut. She and her 2 teenage children lived on a farm outside of Gallipolis. She kept cows there, and beginning in 1963-64, she started to have trouble with cattle rustlers who butchered the animals in the field. Whoever they were, she observed, they didn't seem to want the choice cuts. They just took the brains, eyeballs, udders, organs, and, we'd normally throw away. Had she ever caught the culprits in the act? So a classic cattle mutilation. And man, it really bothers me that I can't remember her name, because I think she's also a Mary is the thing. So I just got Mary Hire. But I think her name is like Mary something Hyde. Anyway. Several times, she said, I'd see them out in the field and go after them with a shotgun, but they always got away. They're tall men and they wear white coveralls, which is kind of stupid because they stand out in the dark. And they can certainly run and jump. I've seen them leap over high fences from a standing start. Spring Hill Jacks. Her home burned to the ground during that period, and she built a new one-story ranch house on the same site. One night, when she was alone in the new house, she said she woke up and found herself unable to move. She felt a wave of almost overpowering heat as she heard the kitchen door open. This sounds very much like the Skinwalker Ranch. She had double-locked it before going to bed. While she lay there helplessly, she said she saw a tall figure walk through the kitchen and apparently go out another locked door on the other side. After it left, she was able to move. Other strange sounds pervaded the house, she claimed. She and her children often heard heavy footsteps on the roof and loud metallic clangs. After interviewing her, I drove out alone to her house to talk to her children. The Bryant farm was quite isolated on a hilly back road. The house stood on a knoll overlooking the surrounding fields. Her teenage son was a down-to-earth boy used to the responsibilities of being the man in the family. He confirmed his mother's stories about the rustlers and added some interesting details. He pointed out some nearby trees. One night, he said, as he and his mother were walking up the road, they saw a large glowing object hovering directly above the trees. She was scared real bad, he noted. Their telephone often went dead for no reason. Other times they'd get calls that just consisted of strange beeping sounds and electronic music. He also mentioned the big gray flying boxcars that often flew over the area at treetop level. It's a wonder they don't crash, he said. If they flew any lower, they'd have to put their wheels down. When I examined the kitchen on the little house, I found that the locked door through which the nocturnal phantom had supposedly exited led to nowhere. There were no steps outside, just a very steep drop of about 10 feet to the ground. Later, I checked with the local police about rumors of disappearing dogs and cattle in the area, and I brought up Mrs. Bryant's name. That poor woman. I was told she's always seeing things. Just a couple of months back, she came in here with some story about spacemen walking around Gallipolis. Before that, it was cattle rustlers. So Mrs. Bryant still sits on her farm, watching the strange lights in the fields, and when her phone rings, she waits a long time before she picks it up. Hey, end chapter 10. Thank you for being here. I have been Shaggy Philalitea. This is right at an hour. You have a great day. And remember, kids, eyes open, hands up. You never know what you might see.